The responsive engine itself for Bubble is really just based on 3 high-level principles. At the highest level, we have layout, which simply refers to the high-level pattern for how elements are going to arrange themselves within a container. Underneath that, you have offsets. So you've got elements within a container. Their positions are dictated by the pattern, by the layout, and now you can offset them some amount from the space that the layout is positioning them in. So you can offset them by a certain number of pixels from where the layout dictates they should be. And then finally, you have sizing, which is within that layout that you've been given and within any offsets that are constraining the space around an element, how big or how small can an element actually be? How should it inhabit the space that it's been allocated? These are the 3 principles: layout, offsets, and sizing. So you can even, if it helps, turn it into a little acronym, LOSS. I don't know if that will help, maybe it will. Write it on your wall if it does. Now, the other thing that we just have to understand before we get into the meat of how the responsive engine functions is the terminology of parent containers and children elements. And all I mean by that is in Bubble, obviously we have all of these container elements, and inside of those elements, we can put other kinds of elements, okay? So we can have some elements living inside of others, or in other words, some elements are nested within other elements, okay? So the high level container that is holding other elements, we call the parent. And the elements inside of that container, we call the children. And this is important because when we start looking at how all these responsive settings work, okay, we're going to be setting them either at the parent level or at the child level. So let's dive in. Let's start with layout. Now, all your pages start with layout. Okay, layout is the most important setting. Remember, as I said, this sets the high level pattern for how elements should arrange themselves. Everything else comes after. Now, to set layout, we always set it at the container level. Okay, so we set the layout for a container, and then all the elements inside of that container arrange themselves according to the layout. And the first container that we have for any page in our Bubble app is the page itself. Okay, so the page is basically, patient 0, so to speak. It's container 0. It's the first container that we have to configure our responsive settings for. Okay, and it helps in this case while we're learning responsiveness just to stick to, arranging elements within the page itself and not worrying too much about nested groups. So we can start to build a bit of intuition. So what we do is we open up the element inspector for a parent container. So in our case, the page, okay? And over in the layout tab, we have this container layout setting, okay? Now fixed is the most intuitive one for you to get your head around, because if I grab a group and I put it here on the page, I can just drag and drop it, right? I can put it anywhere within this fixed container, okay? The fixed container, of course, being the page itself. So a fixed container literally just means that the size of that container is fixed. It's not going to change its width. It's never going to change its height. It doesn't matter what size screen that we're viewing it on. So right now, my index page is 960 by 600 pixels. If I was to change the background color here to something that we're going to see a little bit more clearly and preview this, you can see that the page actually stops at these margins. Here's a handy little tool. I can see how big is my browser, and my browser is 1536 pixels wide, okay? My page, however, my page is only 960 pixels wide. And so when we're previewing, we're seeing this extra space, the difference between that 1536 and the 960. Okay, and it doesn't matter what size screen I'm viewing this on, my page will always stay this size. And if I was to shrink my browser, okay, you can see that it's actually just staying at that 960. So this is fixed, right? It doesn't matter what size my browser is, the page size, the container size is fixed. So this is a layout that you're going to use only for really small components that you might build. Things like small buttons or upvote counters or, little automatized little components that you're going to place within your app that are going to fit on any screen size. Aside from those small components, you're basically never going to use fixed width because your users are all going to be viewing your application on different size screens. So we don't want it to be fixed width. Now, the second container layout that we can set here is align to parent. So if I select that, you'll see that this group snapped to this top center position. Okay, so what this does, if I've got a parent container with align to parent, then for any child elements inside, okay, so if I go to my elements tree, right, this is the child element for the page, group A, I am able to set the position of this group on a nonant. And a nonant is simply just a grid with 9 cells in it, okay? Think of a tic-tac-toe kind of grid. So for any of the children elements within a nonant, you are able to set its position in one of those 9 sections, right? It's like a quadrant, except it's split into 9 sections. That's how Bubble describes it in their documentation. So right now it's in the top center. I can put it top left. I can put it bottom right. I can put it right and in the middle, right? So you get the idea. So this can be useful where you've got a group that you want to have another element kind of like snugly fitting at the bottom, or perhaps you want the element to be over in the top right-hand corner. Okay, the important thing to note about these nonants, let's say that I put an icon in here. Let's call it the heart icon, okay? And I make group A of type align to parent as well. So I'm now able to set this icon in any of the positions. So this can be quite cool if you want to have like a little card, maybe a product card or an event card or something like that, where users can like or favorite the data inside of that card. So what align to parent allows you to do is overlay other elements within this nonant structure. So that's an important thing to note, okay? The elements inside of an align to parent container are overlaid on top of that container. That is different to how rows and containers work, which we're going to get to in a moment. So let's go on to row. I'm going to set this layout to be a row. You can see that immediately this group snapped to the top left corner. Okay, and I just want you to note, okay, at the moment, let's set this inner group A to be a fixed width, and let's give it kind of a square shape, 300 by 300 pixels. Now, the parent container, right, is a row. If I duplicate this group, so I'm going to go Control D on my keyboard, you can see that another cell, another one of my little blue groups here, went right next to it. And I can't drag this. If I let go of this now, it's just going to snap back into that position because the parent container is dictating the position of these groups, right? That's what we mean when we say that a layout is setting that high level pattern for how all of the elements inside of it should be arranged. So this group and this group are having their positions set by this row container layout. And any other elements that I add here are going to be added to the row. What happens when they can't all fit on a row? They'll go into the next row. And so on, and so on. Okay? So Bubble will just keep creating rows so that it can fit all of the elements that it needs. And what's cool about this is, let me just delete some of these groups. If I go to my responsive tab here, okay, I'm able to change the size of my screen and see how the elements behave. So if I bring this down, boom, you saw that that last group went down to the row below. Okay, so there's a couple of kind of high level principles to highlight here. And I'm going to add a little number to each of these. So this is going to be group 1, this is going to be group 2, and this is going to be group 3. And remember, each of these children groups, okay, so this group, this group, this group, these all have a fixed layout, which is why I'm able to arrange this text element inside them as I want to. So a couple of high-level things to point out here is that elements will always try to stay as high up as they can inside of the row. So while there's space here in the row, this number 3 group wants to stick right up the top there and wants to stick right up as high as it can go. But when the page shrinks, it's going to be the last to go. It's the bottom of the pecking order, so to speak. So the elements that are further down in the hierarchy are going to pop to the next row before elements that are higher up in that group. Now you can see here that all of these groups are aligned to the left. They are left aligned. We can change that. They don't have to be left aligned. If I open up the element inspector for the page, right, the parent container, I can actually change this layout to be center. And let me just zoom out a little bit so we can kind of see this a bit clearer. There we go. So I can align them to the center. Okay, so all the groups within this row layout now are trying to squeeze themselves into that horizontal center of the group. I can go right aligned, okay? So just the inverse of left aligned. They're gonna try and snap as close to that right margin as they can. I can do space around. So all of these elements are trying to have exactly the same left and right margins. And by margins, I mean the space between the edge of the element and the next element alongside it, okay? So you can see that between 1 and 2, we've got 50 pixels. Between 2 and 3, we've got 50 pixels. And between the edge of those, you know, those outside groups and the page border itself, we've got 25 pixels and 25 pixels. And by the way, I have got show distances on hover ticked here from my grids and borders section, which means that I can just hover over these elements and see their sizing properties just as I'm hovering. So that is space around. We also have something called space between, which works exactly the same way, only now the outside elements are going to try and snap themselves right to the edge of the container. So in our case, right to the edge of the page. And then all of the other elements in that row are going to use the space around rule, essentially. They're going to share the remaining space equally. If I was just to reduce the width here by half, let's say 150, let's see how this behaves now. So I'm going to duplicate this by Control D. You can see that immediately that second element snapped to the edge. Okay, so that's what it wants to do by default. It wants to fill those two edges, those two horizontal edges of the parent container. And then everything else, if I continue to duplicate this, is going to share the remaining space. So this group now sharing the space between the two. If I add one more, now those two elements are sharing that space. Third element, fourth element, and we can no longer fit another element here in that row. So it's now moving to the next row and so on. Now, I'm just going to delete these guys again, and I'm going to add a text back in here so we have a number so we can identify these groups. And I'm going to make this guy number 2, add another group. This will be number 3, add another group. This will be number 4. Okay. Now, what if I wanted to change the order of these groups? Well, pretty easy. Bubble just released a feature that lets me grab one of these items and drag it to another place in the row, as so. And it's a little bit buggy, I found, at the time of recording this. Sometimes you get this kind of weird stuff where it doesn't quite snap in the right position. But what you can always do is if you double click on an element and go into the element inspector, under layout, you have the option to actually change the order of the element itself, just using this section here. So I can, with this number 4, I could bump it up 1 step in the hierarchy like this, or back 1 step in the hierarchy. Rather, I'm saying these kind of back to front. Previous is actually bumping it kind of higher up in the hierarchy. Next is pushing it further down. I can also make it the last item, the first item. So pretty intuitive. Now, the last thing that's worth pointing out here is that at the moment, our elements obviously are in a row layout, right? That's the pattern, a row. So they're aligning themselves horizontally, one after the other. But vertically, they're all just snapping to the top of this parent group. we have control over that vertical positioning as well, the vertical axis. All we do is come over to vertical alignment, and we do this. We can set that vertical alignment for any of these children elements independently. So you can see at the moment, it's top aligned. I could make it center aligned. I could make it bottom aligned. This last section here, which is called vertical stretch, we're going to talk about in a few moments. That relates to the sizing section. But for now, just know we can set the vertical alignment for any of these elements in a row independently. So I could set this guy to be in the middle, right? This guy again to be down the bottom. So you can create any kind of like random patterns like this if you so would wish. The other thing to point out here is that, let me delete these groups, and I want to make my number one group here 300 pixels wide again. And let me just get rid of the number, okay? And I'll make it vertically aligned again. If I duplicate this group a couple of times again, so we've got some groups here now down the bottom, and I just make the minimum height of my page canvas here. At the moment it's set to 600. Let me just set it to 800, okay? You can immediately see that there's now some space between this top row and the bottom row. Now, what Bubble does here is it takes the height of the parent container, so in our case, this index page, and it splits it into however many rows it needs to fit the elements that it has. Okay, so right now, it's got 6 elements. Given the width of the page, if we take, at the moment, let's say 992 is our page width. At the moment, to fit all of these elements, it needs 2 rows. Okay, if I was to continue to duplicate, then it would create some more rows. Okay, and it would just extend its height as needed. That's how this is working at the page level now, to fit all of those rows. So right now, we've got 6 elements fitting within this page height of 800 pixels, but the groups themselves are only 300 pixels high. So they take up in total 600 pixels when stacked on top of one another. Given that the page is 800 pixels, that means that we've got 200 pixels to spare, right? 800 minus the 600 pixels, which is the sum of this element in the top and the equivalent element in the bottom, which are both 300. So the row for this container is actually 400 pixels, right? It's 800 divided by 2. So there's 2 rows here. And how I can show you this is right now, this group is aligned to the top. What if I align it to the bottom? There you can see that it's perfectly in line because this bottom one is aligned to the top. This top group is aligned to the bottom. So they're kind of snapping. So the bottom of the row, this top row here is right here, is right in this line here. So that's where one row ends and the next one starts. And you can see that, of course, the row in this case is higher than the elements inside of it. The row here is actually going to be 400 pixels. The element inside is only 300. So we've got this space. So this is just one thing to watch out for. This is going to make a little bit more sense when we get into the sizing section, because it does depend on how your parent container is determining its height. Right now with the page, we've got a minimum height of 800 pixels. So the page doesn't want to be less than 800 pixels, but it can extend more than that. If I add some more groups here, you can see that space has disappeared because the page now has actually extended its height to fit all of these groups. They're each 300 pixels high. So 300 plus 300 plus 300 equals 900. So the page is just creating the extra pixels that it needs to fit those additional rows and no more. That's what's happening right now. So we'll get into this in a little bit more detail shortly when we talk about sizing. So that's rows. What about columns? Well, columns work in a very similar way and are actually even a little bit simpler. Let me show you. I'm going to delete all of these groups here by this guy, which I'll align to the top. And I'm going to set now the container layout for the parent, for the index page, to be a column. So right off the bat, we don't see anything has changed. Since we're dealing with the pattern, okay, we want to see how multiple elements probably are going to appear. So let me duplicate this group. Boom. So a column is just stacking those groups one after the other vertically. So there's no concept of rows. One element per row is how you can kind of think of it. And within each of those rows, we can align that group. So right now it's left aligned. I could also align it to the center. I can also right align it. So one way of thinking about this is that row and container layouts are setting the arrangement pattern on one axis. So for a row, right, that's the horizontal axis. For a column, that's a vertical axis. But each individual element within that layout can set its positioning independently on the opposite axis. So here we're dealing with a column. So the vertical positioning of these elements is determined by the parent container's layout, but its horizontal axis, the opposite axis, can be set per element, as so. Now, by combining rows and columns, we can do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to actually structuring, a high-level page architecture. So for example, like let's go on Airbnb here and have a look at a couple of examples. So right here, we've got a row. Okay, this is, elements that are aligned horizontally, but each one of these cards in the row looks like a column layout group, okay, because it's got an image up the top and then it's got some text that's all stacked vertically. Same thing over here. We've got a row, got two groups side by side, and inside we've got a column layout. But overall, look at the structure of this page itself. We've got a group, another group underneath. We've got this kind of row group, another group here. So the group itself is a column layout, right? We're stacking things vertically within the overall page layout. And then down the bottom here, we've got a footer. This again looks like a row, and each one of these rows is itself a column. And then down the very bottom, we've got a row with some elements inside of it. So most pages that you see will have some version of this, some combination of rows and columns, which when you think about it, we're dealing with a screen. A screen only has 2 dimensions, and so it makes sense that everything that you see would be some combination of laying things out on those 2 dimensions. All right, so that's layout. What about offset? Okay, as I mentioned, layout gives us that high-level pattern, but what if we want to just deviate from that pattern a little bit? What if we want one of the elements inside of that pattern to not be in this precise position, but to just be offset by a certain number of pixels? So that's what offsets allows us to do. So the most intuitive starting point to understand this is if I have 2 elements here and I've got them in a row page layout. What if I just want this right-hand group, which I'll just change the color of ever so slightly. What if I want this right group to just not be exactly flush, okay, but just to be offset by a little bit? For that, I can use something called margin. So margin we set on each element individually. So if I go to my group A here, this first blue group, down the bottom, I can set a margin. So I could set a right margin here of say 40 pixels, and that's going to then push that group B 40 pixels away. Okay, so the margin is just the space between the boundary of the element and any other elements around it. And it doesn't just count for sibling elements like this, right? These 2 elements on the page are both children of the page. The page has got the row container layout, but margin can also be used to push children elements away from their parent, away from the boundary or the edge of their parent. So on this blue group A over here, I could also add a left margin, let's say of 100 pixels, and that's going to push it 100 pixels away, just like that. Okay, so it's as if the child element is inside of the parent, just like pushing away, right? Pushing into the parent's belly, so to speak. Now, what if we wanted all elements inside of a parent, all children elements, to be like an equal space away from the boundary of the parent? Like right here, we're setting 100 pixel margin on this blue group, or 100 pixels away from the parent. What if I wanted 100 pixels away from the top and I wanted this red group to be exactly the same? Okay, I wanted it to be 100 pixels away from the top. For that, we use a different concept called padding. Now, we can't set padding on the page itself. We can only set it on containers. So what I'm gonna do to show you this, I'm just gonna remove my group B here, and I'm just gonna grab some text. I'm gonna put some text inside of my group A here. Now, what I wanna make sure that my group A is not a fixed container layout. I know it doesn't really matter what I choose here as long as it's not fixed. Okay, and that's because if it's fixed, then we're not going to be able to do padding settings here. We can't handle padding on fixed container groups. So I've just got this text now. Let's just make it just really small because I don't want to get us to get confused here by too many kind of interacting elements. So this text is comfortably fitting within this group A here, right? And why don't I just give it some text and just make it stand out a little bit more, and then just duplicate it a few times, okay? So you can see that this group A is extending its height to fit these elements, and that's because it is a column layout, and we'll talk more about kind of variable heights and widths shortly. For now, let's just notice, like we've got all of these texts here inside of this group. What if I want them all to have a gap between the left edge of this text and the left edge of the parent group? Okay, so I want to create some margin here on this group, right? Like I want to go, let's say left margin 40 pixels, and this guy as well, 40 pixels, right? I want all of these to be offset from the edge of the parent by 40 pixels. I could do it just this way, as I've been demonstrating, by adding a margin to each one. However, very inefficient. If you followed some of my other videos, I like talking about the dry principle, do not repeat yourself. So we're clearly repeating ourselves in this scenario here, right? We're clearly adding too much margin to too many elements. So what we can do instead is set padding to the parent group. Okay, so that is going to be essentially restricting the available space for the child elements to inhabit. You can think of it like reverse margin, okay? It's pushing the border of that parent element inwards so that all of the elements inside are going to be at that new inward border. So how do I do that? I'm going to set, let's say, a left padding here of 40 pixels. You can see there all of those texts have been offset together. So that kind of gray stripe there, that represents the amount of padding for the parent container. So yeah, it's an extension of the space that the children elements cannot inhabit. And I could add some top padding as well, let's say 60, some bottom padding, again 60. If these elements were squeezed right over to the right-hand side, then right padding would also show us some different behavior here. So this is really useful for getting consistent alignment with children elements inside of parent containers. So for example, again, let's look at Airbnb. It's got a great UI, so it's a good example here. Look at this card here, this reserved card. Look at this even spacing around the border of it, right? All of this text here, the button, these date pickers, the pricing text, it's all beautifully aligned. So you better bet your bottom dollar that's because there's some padding here, okay? There's some padding on this group, okay? And you know what? We can actually, let's be a bit cheeky here. I'm gonna right click, inspect. I'm going to just come up to this little button over here, which is gonna let me select the element on this page to inspect it. And look, if I hover over this card, what does it say right there? Padding 24 pixels. So we're essentially getting Airbnb to tell us here, using Chrome DevTools, how much padding it's using. This is a little tip. If you go on websites, you can do this. You can just use your Chrome Inspect tab, click on this little guy over here, hover over an element, or even click on it. And if you click on it, let me just, if I come over to this three-dot menu and I detach my DevTools here, you can actually see all of the styling properties for an element. Okay, so this is the styling properties for an element. Okay, so if you're familiar with the traditional web stack at all, you'll recognize this as CSS. And I can click over on this computed section here and I can actually see, look, for this element, these are all of the styling properties, just like we would define in our bubble editor. So here you can see padding left, padding bottom, padding top, 24 pixels. And this is just another kind of cute view that DevTools gives us here. We can see, look, there's 24 pixels of padding there. So padding is something that you want to use liberally when you're trying to get this kind of internal alignment inside of a parent container. Now again, on Airbnb, let's go back to the homepage. Look at this row of cards and look at this beautiful white spacing in between. How do we do that in Bubble? Well, based on the toolkit that we've been exposed to in this video, you might think, okay, each of these groups has a right margin. We're giving Raglan here a right margin, Whitianga a right margin, Auckland a right margin. Okay, so in our application, if I delete this group, let's make sure the parent container here is a row. It is. I'm going to add another fixed container group here just to keep things simple and make it 300 pixels by 300 pixels. Now, if I duplicate this, Control D, and I want to get that same kind of behavior, maybe I'll just make my page a little wider here. I want to get the same behavior here where I've got this gap in between my groups. So yeah, what I could do obviously is I could go, okay, let's give it a bit of a right margin. Let's say 32. And then on my middle group, I'll also go 32, okay? And so on and so on. If I have more groups here in another row, I'll have to do the same thing, okay? Right margin, 32. So again, of course, what are we doing? It's disgusting, we're repeating ourselves. It's gross, let's not do it. Let's use something way more powerful, which is a setting that we set at the parent level. That's something that Bubble's letting us do here, you know, with padding, with the layout, and now with this other setting of getting gap in between these groups, is setting these properties at the parent level, which all of the children inherit. We don't have to set things independently for each child element. We set it once, we define the pattern once, and then all of the elements inside of that container adapt themselves respectively. So in practical terms, that means opening up the element inspector for the parent container, which in our case is the page, and we have this apply gap spacing between elements. Tick that, we can add here a column gap, right? So the space between each of these vertical groups. So I could add my 32 pixels there and see how all of those groups have adapted automatically. And if I have some more of them and I want to have a gap between them in the row, then you guessed it, I just use a row gap. Okay, so we can set all these things all at once, super powerful. Okay, and these settings will respect the horizontal alignment in the case of rows too. If I go center alignment, right alignment, it's still the same. If I go space around, okay, there's actually a little bit of extra space here. And that's because Bubble has taken into account this column gap when it is determining how much space it should get. If I remove this, they'll be moved closer together. Okay, so it's making sure that they have at least that 32 pixels and then they're sharing the remaining space equally. Same thing for space around. Now, sizing. Sizing is probably the most difficult one of these settings to get your head around. But that shouldn't scare you. It's not difficult, it's just relatively a little bit more difficult because there's a few different settings, and at this point, all of our responsive settings are all starting to interact with each other, right? It's getting hard to detach why an element is appearing or behaving the way that it is because we've got all these multiple settings that are impacting on its behavior. But at a high level, all sizing is how large or small an element should be, okay? That's all it is, okay? Because we're not dealing here with fixed sized elements, unless of course we have a fixed container layout, okay? Which is what we've been doing here to demonstrate, but that's not how our pages are gonna function well out in the world. Again, let's go back to Airbnb. I'm gonna go back to my developer tools here, and I'm just gonna dock it at the bottom so that I can kind of dynamically change this. And you can see, look at these Look at these location cards. Look at their width. See how it shrinks? Shrinking and growing. So those aren't fixed containers, right? The size of those containers is changing. And then you can see we get below a certain page width and then we snap into 3 cards. Now, we'll show you how to do that as well, but just look at the way that it's changing in size. Okay, this center group here, this let your curiosity do the booking group. See how it's shrinking here with the page. Okay, it's not just a fixed size. Okay, so we want to create the same kind of behavior in our application. We're not dealing with fixed widths or fixed heights. These things can be variable. So let me show you. I'm going to remove all these groups again so that we have a clean slate here to work with. Okay, I'm going to remove my gap spacing. I'm also going to set this container layout for the page to column. While we're just getting used to sizing, it's just going to make things a little bit easier. Okay, you'll see why in a moment. And for this group A, I don't want it to be a fixed container, obviously, because we want the sizing for this container to be variable, to change depending on various factors, including, of course, the page size. So I just want to choose something else here. It doesn't really matter what I choose. I just have to choose something other than fixed layout. And now the settings that we're looking for are down here. So we've got at the moment still a fixed width, and we've got a minimum height here. This is the minimum height setting. I'm just going to tick fixed height, so we just start from kind of like the same starting point. So this right now is behaving just like as if we had a fixed container layout, okay? Instead, we've got fixed width and fixed height. Let's keep the height fixed for now, and let's just deal with width. So if I untick this, look at that. You can see how this group just went poof and just stretched all the way to the edge of the page. It's going as far as it can until it hits the width of the parent container, which in our case is just the page. So like if I was just to preview that group would just expand all the way from one edge of my screen to the other. Okay, it's just taking up the full width of the page itself. What I can do if I don't want it to take up the full width is I can give it a max width. So let's say that I give this a max width of 800 pixels. And now if I preview this page, see how it's only taking up part of the page here. If I look at my responsive tab here, you can see that, you see that red border? Maybe actually I will just make that border a little thicker so you can see it more clearly. Now you see how that red border is just moving with the edge of the page until we get to 800 pixels. So look over here. This is the page width in our responsive tester here. When I get to 800 pixels, it stops. It's just freezes at that 800 pixel mark. That's the max width, okay? This group cannot be any wider than 800 pixels. Doesn't matter how much bigger the parent container gets. Okay, so that's the max width. But we can also set, if I go back to my group A, a minimum width. So you can see we've got a minimum width already set here of 300 pixels. So what's happening there? Well, let's go back to the responsive tab and I'll try and go below 300 pixels and boom. You can see that that red border's actually disappeared behind the canvas now. Our page is getting smaller than what this group is allowed to do. Okay, so that's as small as the group can go. So if I go to my Chrome DevTools and try this out, you can see it's shrinking there. And if I keep going down, you can actually see we're not even at 300 pixels yet. I think that's because of the debugger. So let me remove that. So I just deleted the debugger parameter and now, yeah, okay, so now it's working properly. So I can go all the way up to 800, but no larger. And then I can shrink down to 300. And then once I get to 300, then we're getting this kind of just scaling down behavior, okay? That width is not responding dynamically anymore. So this is how an element can try and be as big as it can, but we can also tell this element, tell this group to be as small as it can. And to do that, we simply have to tick fit width to content. That group now is trying to constrain its space and get as small as it can. It's trying to shrink down as small as it can. And what's restricting it getting any smaller than it currently is this minimum width here. This minimum width at 300 pixels. So indeed, we're actually at 300 pixels here for the size of this group. If I made this 100 pixels, you see that it shrinks down even further. And to make this element again try to be as big as it can, we simply untick fit width to content, okay? And I'll bump that minimum width up as well. So we've essentially got two modes here that an element can be in. Stretch mode, where it will try to be as big as it can, and shrink mode, where it will try to be as small as it can. And how big or small it can be has a little bit of nuance to it. We're going to get to that in a moment. Just before we do, I just want to show you, we've been talking about stretching or shrinking the width of an element, but we can also do the same thing for the height. Okay, so let's keep things simple. Let's make our element here, our group, a fixed width, and we're going to untoggle fixed height. So let's try and get a variable height here. Now, by default, within our parent group's column layout, our group A is fitting its height to content. So that is the same thing as saying this group is in shrink mode. It's trying to be as small as it can be. And what's constraining it is this minimum height. If I change that to 100, you can see it immediately shrinks down now to 100. If I change that to 0, it basically disappears into nothing. The only reason we can see it is because it's got such a thick border. Okay, that border can't be, you can't shrink the border down. You can only shrink the container size itself, what's inside of that container. But if I untick this, that group will now try to be as tall as it can, okay? As tall as it possibly can. And so together, if I toggle off, make this element fixed width, we've got now this element trying to be as wide as it can in the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. So it's in stretch mode for both axes, which essentially means it's taking up the entire space of its parent container, right? The parent container in our case is the index page. So this is a nice starting point for us to try and understand what is going to restrict a group expanding or shrinking below a certain amount. We've already seen we've got minimum width, max width, we've got minimum height, max height, okay? That creates a range, that creates a band within which an element can shrink and expand. But there are other restrictions on the size that an element can take up as well. So to set up to just demonstrate that, I'm going to get rid of all minimum widths, and I'm just going to keep this max width of 800, which is essentially the same thing as saying the page can't get any bigger than 800, because we're going to put all of our other elements inside of this group here, and we'll just forget about the rest of the page for now. So we've got an 800 pixel canvas here to work from. Now let's dial down the border again, okay, just to 1. And let me add now a group inside of our group A, okay? And to keep things organized, I'll call the top level group here the parent, and I'll call this group B here the child. Now, as before, we could make our child just take up the whole space of its parent, right? I could go to layout, I make sure I'm not choosing fixed layout, so I'll go column, no fixed width. I don't want to be fitting height to content, and you can see that that second group is just taking up all of the space of the parent. So let's talk about stretch mode restrictions. How big can an element get? We've already seen that an element can't get any bigger than its max width. So we know that the parent group is 800. If I change this max width of the child group to be 500, you can see, look, there we go. There's some space now between the edge of the parent and the edge of the child. The child is only taking up a fraction of that parent width size. And I can also change this to be a percentage, just by the way. So at 100%, yeah, it's taking up 100% of the width. But at 50%, it's only taking up half, okay? And so that will scale dynamically. Let me get rid of this minimum width here so we can kind of see this a bit clearer. As the parent group shrinks or expands, okay, at any point, at any page width, this child group is always going to be taking up 50% of the parent's width. So that's one thing that we can do. That's one way we can restrict it, is with max width. I'll just change this back to be pixels and I will get rid of the maximum width altogether. Now, the other thing that restricts how large an element can be are any offsets. So if on the parent, I add some padding, let's say I add 150 pixels of padding at the top, you can see this child group is now having its available space encroached upon. It's having to kind of shrink down because the parent is kind of enforcing this padding space above it. So of course that can be done on any side here. We can add padding. So now this group, it's trying to be as big as it can, okay, but the space that it has to work with is the parent group's width, right, plus, or rather minus, any of the padding that's set at the parent. In addition, if I was to add margin onto this child, right, if I was to add a left margin of say 60 pixels, okay, that is also encroaching on the size here, right? It's actually shrinking. The group is shrinking here. It's not moving over to the right-hand side anymore, okay, because it's actually, it can't go any further right. We've got this right padding here on the parent. In fact, I can remove that and you will see it's exactly the same, right? It's snug right up against the right side of this parent group. And so any margin that I add to this child, if I add 400 pixels, for example, it's just going to encroach on that available space even more. So as long as an element is allowing itself to have its width or height variably changed, then any offsets are just going to encroach on the size that it has. Okay, you can think of it as a reduction in the space that this element has to expand into. Okay, I'm just going to get rid of the margin and I'm going to get rid of the padding as well here. And now I want to show you the third kind of category of thing that's going to restrict the space that this child element has to expand into, okay? And that is other child elements, or from the perspective of this child, its siblings. So if I duplicate this child, now we've got child, we'll call it child A and child B. Okay, and I will change the layout of the parent to be a row here. Okay, we'll deal with height separately. So now we've got child A, child B, they're both taking up the same amount of horizontal space here, right? If I want them to take up the vertical space as well, I just tick this vertical alignment here for each of them. Okay, that's essentially saying turn off fit height to content. Okay, Bubble has these settings here, vertical stretch, and it has these fit width or fit height to content settings. So it can get a little bit confusing as to which one to use. And as I understand it, it's due to some of the underlying complexity with how Flexbox, which is the technology behind the responsive engine, how that technology works as to why they have these two different settings. But just remember that they are doing the same thing, okay? They're toggling on or off stretch mode or shrink mode. So we have two groups here, two children. They are both stretching horizontally and vertically, as they're both in stretch mode on both axes. However, as you can see, of course, they're having to share the available space, the available horizontal space of the parent container, right? You know what, I think I'll make this parent a little bit bigger. Let's say 1,000 pixels. So this is clearly a restriction on how big each of these children can be, okay? It's having to share the available space equally with its siblings. If I make the page larger than that max width of the parent, so larger than 1,000, okay, so we've got an 1,000 pixel wide parent group that's being shared equally amongst two children, okay, you can see that the width here is actually 499. That's because we've got a 1 pixel border here on the parent. If I get rid of that, we should see, there we go. So we're getting 500 pixels across for both of these children groups here, okay? So just by the way, like if you add a border to a group, that encroaches on the inside space of that group. Okay, so these two children element essentially had 1 pixel less each to work from because the parent group had a border that was 1 pixel wide. So it's almost like an extra bit of padding on the inside when you have a border existing on a parent container. But anyway, that's getting a little bit off track. The point that I'm trying to show you here is that both of these children groups are having their max width essentially set at 500 pixels because they're having to share the overall width, 1000 pixels, with one other child. If I was to add a third child in here, now you can see it's actually split 3 ways. They've got 333 pixels each. So by default, children elements or sibling elements will share the space available equally. However, they will not share it equally if they do not have equal minimum widths. I don't know why I've got copy there in the title. So right now, child A and child B both have no minimum width, a minimum width of 0 pixels. Let's see what happens here if I change, let's say I change the minimum width of child A here to, let's say 400 pixels. And for child B, we'll give it a minimum width of 100 pixels. See how much more space that first child is taking up than the second one here? I might just add back a border here so it's a little clearer for us. 5 pixel border. So we can just see, we can see a bit clearer here that the demarcation between the two. So child A is clearly taking up more width than child B, okay? And the reason for that is because Bubble will make sure that children elements that are in stretch mode will share the available space relative to their minimum widths. And what that basically means is that they will both hit their minimum widths at the same time. So this guy here has a minimum width of 400 pixels. This one has a minimum width of 100 pixels. So at 500 pixel screen size, or technically speaking, when the parent group is 500 pixels wide, 400 of those pixels will be for child A, 100 pixels will be for child B. So you can actually see that, you know. If I come down here to 500 pixels, more or less, you'll see that this group over here is taking up the lion's share, and then the small guy is just taking up that last 100 pixels. And if we get below that, well, now we're actually pushing one of them below because they both can't fit, given their minimum widths, within the same row at this page size, right? So that's why it's now going down to the next level. And we can achieve the same behavior if instead of using pixels, we use a percentage too. Like if I say 80% for child A and 20% for child B, we'll get the same behavior, only now we won't have this weird position where the page will get below a certain width and then one of the groups, one of those children will snap to the next row, because they're both going to share their available space no matter what the page width is, right? Child A is always going to take up 80% of the parent group's width, and child B is always going to take up that last 20% of the parent group's width. Now, I've shown you these principles for the width, okay, but it's really the same principles for height as well. Let's make both of these groups fixed width, okay, and we'll change the parent to be a column instead, right? I can have both of them have no minimum height and they will share that available space equally. But as soon as I give one of them a disproportionate minimum height, then the other one will shrink accordingly. The only difference here is that if they both have a minimum height that won't fit cumulatively together, are higher than what the parent group can hold, right? So this parent group here, let me give it back a grid so we can see it. The parent group might have a max height, say, of 800 pixels. And I'll just give our overall canvas here a larger width so we can see, you can see that we're actually having the children elements extend over because the parent group can only be 800 pixels high. Our first group, our child A, wants to be at least 500 pixels high, and our second child element wants to be at least 400 pixels high, which is 900 pixels in total, which is more than that 800 pixels max height. And so they're actually going to extend over the edge of the parent container. There's nowhere for them to snap to, unlike a row layout where they can always snap to the next row. In a column layout, there are no more columns that they will be added to. So that's how elements behave when they're in stretch mode. In shrink mode, it's very similar, but there are a few other nuances to it. So let's go back to just having a parent and a child for a moment. I'm going to give my child a max width of 400 pixels. And my parent, I want to put it into shrink mode. So I want my parent to try and be as small as it can. So I am going to go fit width to content. So that's making it shrink mode. Now, of course, I can have a minimum width, as we saw before, so it won't go below 800 pixels. Now we can have a minimum width, as we saw before, so it won't go below 800 pixels. But if I've got no minimum width, it'll just try to get as small as it can, all the way down to 0 pixels, essentially. Unless it hits the minimum width or the fixed width of its children elements. So right now, this child element has a minimum width of 400 pixels. Our parent wants to be as small as it can, but it's now hitting that 400 pixel width of the child. So it can't get any smaller than that. Okay, the child inside is essentially like putting its foot down. It's like, you're not getting any smaller. You're not getting any smaller. So the parent is just right up against the child, but the child is just holding firm. You're not getting any smaller than this. And so if I was to even make this child element larger, like say 600 pixels, then the parent would have no choice but to oblige and to just let itself get bigger as the child kind of pushes it from the inside out. And this is obviously with a fixed width child, but the same thing would apply with a minimum width, okay? Because the minimum and max widths are essentially like the gospel for an element. They will never go smaller or bigger than their minimum and max widths, no matter what. Now, it's not just the minimum or fixed width of the children elements that prevent a parent getting smaller, but it's also the minimum or fixed widths of any of the children elements inside of its children. So its grandchildren, essentially, or its great-grandchildren, and so on and so on and so on. So if inside of this child A, I had grandchild, which we'll just keep it as a fixed container layout, and we'll give it 300 pixels so it's easy to see. If my child element now doesn't have a minimum width, then that parent will now just basically constrict all the way down. The child inside doesn't have a minimum width, so it will also shrink all the way down. So the parent on top of the child, and they'll both shrink down until they hit the grandchild inside of the child. So it's like kind of like a Russian doll situation where there's at the bottom level of the hierarchy here, there's this grandchild that is just stuck at 300 pixels wide. If I halve that, you'll see everything gets smaller. If I expand that, you'll see everything gets bigger. Okay, so everything will shrink down until it hits the minimum or fixed width, essentially the width below an element won't go. Everything will shrink down until it hits that width for any of the derivative elements, any of the elements downstream in the hierarchy. The same thing goes here. I've been talking about containers, but if we have my parent and the child, which are both at the moment trying to be as small as they possibly can. So let me just add a minimum width for my child group just to give us something to work with here. If I add some text and I say, you shall not pass, let's just make it a little bigger as well, okay? This text independently doesn't need to have a fixed width. It can fit width to content, so the element itself will shrink until it hits the content inside, so the text itself. So if I get rid of this minimum height, you can see that the height of the text element actually constricted there. So if I untick that, it'll go all the way down to the bottom. If I tick it, it'll go all the way, up as high as it can. It'll try to make the height of this text element as small as it can without actually encroaching on the space where the text content resides. And the same thing for fit width to content. If I make sure it doesn't have a minimum width and I go fit width to content, then you can see that the width also shrunk until it hit the text content. And now on the child, if I get rid of the minimum width here for the child, then again, parent shrinking down, child shrinking down, they're both stopping until they hit this text content here, which is also in shrink mode, right? Because it's fitting width to content. If I reduce the size of the text here, the text content, then everything shrinks down. And as for stretching, when we are in shrink mode, any margin, any padding that we set, that is also going to create an expansion of the space that an element cannot fill. So if I add some margin on this text, say 100 pixels here on the left, 100 pixels on the right, you can see that grandchild element, the text element, is creating this margin on the outside, which then the parent and the child, which are both in shrink mode, they both can't come closer than that text element plus its margin. And the same goes for if on the child I add some padding. I could add even more additional space here that can't be encroached upon, right? Just by adding padding. So all of these offsets, they all stack up. And same thing goes for if I change the container layout here for this child to a row, and then I duplicate this text, and I'll get rid of this margin, right? So that we can actually fit them both. I'll get rid of the padding as well. Same thing here goes for, still got some margin there. Same thing still goes for gap between. I could add a column gap here of say 100 pixels. That's also going to create some additional space, which shrink mode is having to take into account as space that it can't encroach upon. So this kind of thing can be really useful when, let's just use the parent and a text right now, and I'll delete the child just to keep things simple. So we've got one group with a text box inside. If I fit height to content, right? So that parent group is now trying to shrink vertically as small as it can be. The text here, if I add more content to it, like from this lorem ipsum generator here, right, you can see that the whole group height then is now going to expand. So this can be really useful for creating, dynamic height for elements or width, depending on the content inside, right? Depending on maybe the length of a product description or something like that. Then the whole group in which that content resides can adapt its height depending on how much content it needs to hold. So that in a nutshell is really the main gears for how the responsive engine works. Layout, offsets, sizing, right? These three sort of settings, these three parts to the engine that all work together to create dynamic pages. Now, there's one last kind of piece to the puzzle here, which is really critical when creating responsive pages, and that is conditional behavior, okay? Because a lot of these settings that we've been playing with can be changed using the conditional tab depending on the size of the page. So as a really crude example, right here I've got like this massive text. Let me get rid of a max width for the parent group. So this text will just expand. This is not necessarily a use case that you'll ever use, right? But we just got this massive text on the page. Let's say that at 992, okay, we'll show this text as it is, but anything below 992, and we actually want this text to change its font size so it can fit a little bit better on the screen. So to do that, all I do is I click on the text, come over to this conditional tab, And now I can write when the current page width, right, when the width of the actual page itself, the browser that that your viewer is looking at your app through, when that is less than 992, now I can change some properties for this text. Like, for example, I can change the font size. Let's change it to 12. And now in my responsive view, you can see, look, here it is, big, big, big. I get to 992, boom, it shrinks down. Now, where is this useful? Well, if you have some headings in your application that look great on desktop, they're probably too big for mobile. So you could have a point at which the setting, the font size for that text breaks and changes down to a smaller setting. So that's what we would call a breakpoint, okay? It's a page width below which the behavior is different than what it is at or above that breakpoint. So up here at the top, Bubble is kind of just giving us here some easy to use breakpoints. You generally want your breakpoints to work with the content that you have, okay? But you can also look online. There's a lot of different advice about what are good breakpoints to use that fit around kind of common devices. A really popular one in the Bubble community is one that's been popularized, developed by BuildCamp, which has breakpoints at, well, you don't go below 320 pixels because that's the smallest screen size that you have for mobile, but then you just go up in increments of 320. So you have another breakpoint at 640, you have one at 960, and you have one at 1280 if you want to have like a really large kind of screen. So you can just have these points at which when the page goes below that size, the elements on your page adapt. Another really common use case for conditional responsive behavior is these kind of 2-column sign-up forms, right? Which look great at a certain width. We've got like a parent row group here, a form on the left-hand side, an image on the right. And yeah, it looks great at large widths, but when we start to get smaller, things start to break down. That form, we want that form to maintain a certain minimum width there. And so what we can do with conditional behavior is once the page gets below a certain width, we just get rid of this image, right? And then create more real estate for this form. So I could, for example, click on this image, come over to the conditional tab. I'll add again that current page width conditional, and I'll say less than, let's do 960 this time. Okay, let's see how that looks. Then we're going to say this element is not visible, and we're going to make sure that we are collapsing that image as well, so that when it's hidden, its space is going to collapse into nothing, and then this form can basically slide over and start taking up some of that real estate. And so we can just see how that looks within this responsive tab here. Okay, interesting. It still looks good just above 960, and we get below it and then it disappears. And then let's test it out. Okay, so we're at a large screen size here. We're coming down, coming down, coming down. Boom, we hit 960 and that image there disappears. Another example of this are headers. Headers which are going to appear on multiple pages in our app, right? We've got certain elements that we want to be visible on large screens, but as we come down, we're going to hide elements. We're going to hide elements like that search bar. And if we come down even further, then we hide even more stuff, and we can have a sort of a hamburger menu appear instead, okay? So we do all of that conditionally. We do all of that simply with conditional rules. So this group user on the right-hand side has a condition to hide itself below a certain page width. Inside of our group logo, we've got this hamburger icon, which is going to show itself above a certain page width. So I'm not going to get into the meat of exactly how to set this up, but it's just to show you that this kind of conditional behavior is exactly what you want to get used to when creating responsive pages. So that was a pretty condensed and no doubt information dense introduction to the Bubble responsive engine. But what I've tried to do here is give you kind of a big overview of how the engine actually works, the different settings and levers that are exposed to you, that you can then, one, use as a reference when you're going out and building your own stuff, but also this is sort of a good starting point here so that you're not kind of flying blind, just poking around, not understanding why things aren't working, that you can hopefully kind of develop a bit more of a systematic approach to building responsive pages. And if you want to get a whole bunch more kind of exposure and practice, I have a Bubble course, which I'll link to in the description, where we cover how to build a whole bunch of different types of modules and pages and architectures for different applications. So yeah, check that out. Otherwise, just try and recreate as many different apps and modules and pages as you can. There is no substitute for practice. That goes for anything in life, but it's especially true for the responsive engine. Happy bubbling.